Welcome to another segment as we continue with biology videos as we focus on the topic genetics, but this time we are looking at mutation. What exactly is mutation? Well, we can simply say that mutation is a change in the DNA sequence of an organism, or I can simply say that mutation, refers to a change. So it refers to a change in the DNA sequence, of an organism. So that is what we can refer to as being mutation. So the change in the DNA sequence of an organism, we can call it as being mutation. But alternatively, you can also define mutation. We can also say that mutation is a sudden, so we can simply say is a sudden spontaneous, sudden spontaneous change in the chemical structure. So we can say in the chemical structure of a gene, or number of chromosomes. So this is what we can refer to also as being a mutation. So if you want, you can talk about it as being a sudden spontaneous change. Now, of course, when we talk about a sudden spontaneous change, you cannot tell when exactly it is going to happen, meaning that it is just, can occur suddenly without even you noticing that it has actually happened. Now, a few basic ideas that you need to remember about what we are calling as being mutation. Remember, any substance that causes a mutation is called a mutagen. So we can simply talk about, mutagen. Sometimes it is simply called as being a we can refer to it as being a mutagenic factor. So a mutagen or mutagenic factor is any substance that causes a mutation. So any substance that causes mutation is what we simply call as being a mutagenic factor. But of course, an organism that has undergone a mutation is called a mutant. So maybe I can also say that an organism that has undergone mutation is called a mutant. So we call it as being a mutant. So if any organism has undergone mutation, then we simply call it as being a mutant. Now at this point, we can ask ourselves, what are some of the factors that are able to cause mutation? What are some causes in this case? So we can talk about causes of mutation. What are some causes of mutation? Well, the causes of mutation can actually be classified into two. So mutations can occur naturally, or it can actually be triggered by external factors. So maybe I can simply say, there are natural factors or natural causes of mutation that I can simply talk about. And what can this be? Well, one, you can have a spontaneous, chemical change. So you can have a spontaneous, chemical change, in the DNA. So we can simply talk about spontaneous chemical change. Spontaneous chemical changes, maybe I can say, possibly that is coming out well. Two, we can simply talk about maybe, errors in DNA replication. So when the DNA is making a copy of itself, sometimes errors may occur, and those errors may result in mutation. So errors in DNA replication, especially, during, cell division. So that may actually, take place. Now I want to go back on this one. We are simply saying, spontaneous chemical changes. Of course, inside of your DNA, there are chemicals that are found there. For example, let me just quickly tell you about the chemicals that are found there. The four nitrogenous chemicals: adenine, which is represented by A. You have got, thymine, which is represented by capital letter T. You have got guanine, which is represented by capital letter G. And you also have what we are calling as being cytosine, which is represented by C. So now, when there's a change in these chemicals, in the arrangement of these chemicals, there's going to be a mutation can actually take place. For example, in the nitrogenous bases that you have, you are going to find that A will pair with T, or the other way around, T with A, and G, guanine, will always pair with C. So when there's a change in the pairing of these nitrogenous bases, it can actually lead to what we are calling as being a mutation. Now, apart from natural causes, we can simply talk about environmental factors. So we can also talk about environmental factors. So there are some environmental factors that may cause, a change, a spontaneous change, either in the chemical structure of a gene or just the number of chromosomes. Number one, when it comes to environmental factors, and this is what you're going to be finding more common in your exams. One, we can simply talk about, radiation. So you can simply talk about radiation. So exposure to too much radiation can actually cause a change, either in the chemical structure of a gene or the number of chromosomes. So radiation, now radiations, we are simply talking about things like, ultraviolet rays, or light. We can also talk about, X-rays. This may actually contribute to that. Two, I can also talk about maybe chemicals. So we can simply talk about chemicals, those chemicals that are coming maybe from cigarette smoke. Yeah, chemicals from cigarette, smoke, things like, dyes. You can also talk about, too much, preservatives. So taking too much preservatives may in the wrong run cause what we are calling as being a mutation. Of course, these are not the only ones. I can give you some more core environmental factors apart from this. We can also talk about number three. We can simply talk about what we are calling as being, viruses. So viruses can also cause a mutation. So there are some viruses that actually insert their, genetic materials into the host DNA, and they actually change. For example, HIV and AIDS. In this case, the HIV virus, the human immunodeficiency virus, can actually cause a mutation in human beings. So you need to remember, about all this. Well, we can put up other concept under what we are calling as being, mutation, so that we can actually give you a greater scope of what we are talking about. So far, you need to remember, define what mutation is. You need to talk about the causes of mutation. So you should be able, to do that. Now, let's talk about what we are calling as being, types of mutation. What are the types of mutation that we are going to talk about? Well, from an O-level perspective, you're just going to focus on what we are calling as being, it's either you are talking about a gene mutation, or you are simply talking about what we simply call as being a chromosome mutation. That is what we are going to, that is what you're going to look at. But of course, when you advance, you are going to find that mutation in its broader terms, when you look at what we are talking about as being gene mutation, we can simply, classify these mutations as maybe one, what we simply call as being point mutation. So point mutation. Now, point mutation is where a single nucleotide is changed or added, or it could be deleted. So that's what we call as being point mutation. We can also have what we simply call as being insertion. Sometimes we can call it as being deletion. Now, insertion or deletion, this is where an extra DNA bases are actually inserted or deleted. Yeah, so which can shift the way the code is actually read the genetic code or the sequencing of the letters as they appear in your DNA. The third one, we can simply talk about maybe duplication. So there could be duplication. Under duplication, this is where a section of the DNA is copied more than once. Maybe it is repeated more than once. We can talk about. Then maybe lastly but not the least, we can talk about inversion. So inversion is where maybe a section of the DNA flips or reinserts in the opposite direction. So in its broadest sense, when you advance above, you're going to learn about point mutation, insertion or deletion, duplication or inversion that is going to be happening. But for our O-level biology, we are going to focus on gene mutation as well as chromosome mutation. Therefore, we can start with the first one we are calling as being gene mutation. What exactly is gene mutation? Well, when we talk about gene mutation, we can simply say, is the change, I can simply say is the change in the chemical. So we can simply talk about the change in the chemical structure of a gene. So when there's a change in the chemical structure of a gene, like I told you, when it comes to a gene is simply made up of nitrogenous bases that we are talking about. And if you remember those nitrogenous bases, we talked about adenine, you talked about what we are calling as being guanine, we talked about thymine, and we did talk about what we are calling as being cytosine. So these are the four nitrogenous bases. Now remember, adenine will always pair with the thymine and guanine will always pair with the cytosine. So sometimes what can happen is that instead of A pairing with T, A may pair with G or C. So there's a change in the chemical structure of a gene, and that is what we simply call as being gene mutation. Examples of gene mutation. What are some examples of gene mutation that we have? Well, there are so many that we can simply talk about, especially in human beings. Things like, hemophilia. We can simply talk about, sickle. We can talk about sickle cell anemia. Apart from that, we can also talk about, red-green, color blindness. We can also talk about what we are calling as being albinism here. So these are some of the conditions in human being that come about as a result of a mutation in the chemical structure of a gene. So it may result in these conditions. Well, briefly, let me talk about these conditions so that you can become familiar, with them. So let me talk about, this condition under what we are calling as being gene mutation. So now we can start with the first one, which we are calling as being, albinism. We can talk about, and so remember we are still looking at gene mutation. So examples we gave of gene mutation is what we are calling as being albinism. What exactly is albinism? Well, albinism is an inherited, so we can simply say it is an inherited disease. It is an inherited disease where an organism, or if you want, you can say a person, lacks the capacity. So lacks the capacity, to synthesize or to synthesize melanin. So it's a pigment that is found, underneath your skin that gives us maybe the dark complexion for some that are dark. If someone is light, it simply means that they have got less melanin under that. So now albinism is simply an inherited disease where a person lacks the capacity to build or to synthesize melanin that is found in the skin. Well, because of failing to synthesize melanin, you're going to find it results maybe in the skin, hair, eyebrows, eyelashes, or to have a white color. Now, when that happens, you're going to find that even, the iris at times may not contain any melanin at all in those people we are calling as being an albino. Yeah, so that sometimes may result into what we call internal reflection in the eyes, and that makes it difficult for many albinos, to actually, see, clearly or properly, as we can say. So that is what you need to remember about albinism. Number two, we are simply talking about what we are calling as being sickle cell anemia. What exactly is sickle cell anemia? Well, sickle cell anemia is simply, again, an inherited disease where a person has an abnormal hemoglobin. That's what we can talk about. So we can say is an inherited, so maybe I can say is an inherited disease, where a person has an abnormal, so a person has an abnormal hemoglobin. Now, when a person has an abnormal hemoglobin, this actually makes the red blood cells to become sickle shaped. Yeah, especially when the levels of oxygen in the red blood cells are very low, or in your body if they are very low, it simply means that the red blood cells become, sickle shaped. So RBC, become what we are calling as being sickle shaped, in low oxygen. Yeah, in low oxygen levels, in the body. So when the body has got low oxygen levels, the red blood cells become sickle shaped. So that is what you need to remember. Now, the disease, again, what you need to remember is that it actually reduces the capacity of the body to transport oxygen. Why? Because the red blood cells have become sickle shaped. So we can simply say, the disease reduces, so it actually reduces the capacity, of the RBC to transport oxygen. Now, of course, people that are suffering from sickle cell anemia, sometimes they do have an advantage, and that is what you need to, to remember. In most cases, such individuals that are suffering from sickle cell anemia, have reduced incidences of malaria. Why? Because the malaria parasite actually fails to reproduce inside an abnormal red blood cells due to small amounts of oxygen being available. And of course, when they pass in the what we call as being the lymphatic system, such red blood cells that have actually been infected with the malaria parasite like Plasmodium, Falciparum, and so on and so forth, they are actually destroyed in the spleen. So that gives them actually an advantage, so to say. Of course, there are other conditions that I talked about, like hemophilia, color blindness that I talked about in my previous video. Please, you can refer to them so that you can actually gain, more information. Now, before we move on, we can actually look at a question that came in the 2024 under, this discussion that we are having, which is, mutation. So we can actually have, a question. So notice what the question there was saying, what is mutation? So that was the first question. I believe you are able to answer exactly what is mutation. Remember what we said, mutation. Yeah, so we say that if you want, you can define mutation as a change in the DNA sequence of an organism. So you can simply say, change in the DNA sequence, of an organism. So you can answer it. Or you can define and simply say, well, mutation is a spontaneous, so you can simply say is a spontaneous change, in the chemical. So we can simply say in the chemical structure, of a gene or number of chromosomes. So that is what you can talk about. And that was just carrying, I think, 1 mark. Roman 2 there says state two causes in this case of mutation. So they wanted you to talk about causes. One, a person would have talked about radiation, exposure to too much radiations, too much X-rays, ultraviolet can cause mutation. We can also talk about, viruses. So like we said, viruses actually insert their genetic material into the host DNA. They change your DNA, so to say, when they invade your body. Then we can also talk about what we are calling as being, chemicals. Yeah, so there are a lot of chemicals, especially those that are found in tobacco. Many of them are actually carcinogen. They are cancer causing, agents that we can talk about. Dyes, preservatives, too much, exposure or eating them can also cause what we are calling as being mutation. So remember, all these are what we simply called as being these are what we called as being environmental factors that may actually cause what we called as being mutation. I talked about in my discussion also natural causes, such as maybe there's an error in during DNA replication, a cell division is taking place, or just spontaneous chemical changes that take place in your body that may also cause what we are calling as being mutation. But let's look at the B part. The B part, they wanted you to do a genetic diagram. So it says a couple, both with normal skin color, produced an albino child. Explain using genetic diagram how this would have been possible, using the allele capital A and small letter a to represent the genes for skin color. So what I'm going to say, I'm going to write, P1, first parental generation. What is the phenotype that we are having? In this case, I'm going to say, remember they are telling us a couple with normal skin color. So both of them are actually normal. So I'm going to say maybe a male crossing with a female. Or if you want, you can use a father crossing with a mother, there's no problem. Then you can go to what we are calling as being the genotype. Now, because they were normal for skin color, but they produced an albino, it simply means that both the mother and the father were simply carriers. And if they are carriers, it simply means they are heterozygous. So it simply means capital A, small letter A, capital A, small letter A. Because they were both normal, but they are an albino child. The only possible is when each of them is simply a carrier. So when a reduction division takes place, meiosis, it will result in the formation of gametes, and those gametes, they are going to produce what we are calling sex cells that are going to separate. So capital A and small letter A, capital A and small letter A. Please, I love to circle them, but if you want, just show that they have separated, put them at a distance apart. There's no need of you circling if you do not want. So this crosses with that. This actually pairs with the last one. Then I come to this gamete with the first one and this one with the last one. So we are going to have the F1 generation, the first phero generation. The first thing that you are supposed to have is what is in their genes, the genotype. So you are going to have capital A and capital A. There capital A, small a. There capital A, small a. Then small a, small a. So then we can go to the phenotype. If you notice this one here, in terms of skin color, this person has got normal skin color. These ones have also normal skin color, but we can refer to them that they are actually carriers. Then this one here is actually what we are calling as being an albino. So now if you look at the probability, we can even find the probability of them having an albino child. What's the probability? How many albinos? It's 1 over the total number of children, which is 4 times 100. If you want, you can leave it as a fraction 1 over 4, or you can say 1 over 4 times 100, which is a percent, which is going to give you 25%. So that is what they wanted you to do, using a genetic diagram to explain how that is actually possible. Yes, when both parents are carriers, it is possible for them to have an albino child. Now, like I said, that marks the end of this question. So it's coming from the 2024 paper 2 GCE question. You can refer to it. The other type of mutation that I talked about is what we simply called as being chromosome mutation. So let me just briefly talk about what that is. So we can simply talk about chromosome mutation. Chromosome mutation. Now the question that we can talk about is, what exactly is chromosome mutation? Well, chromosome mutation is simply a spontaneous change in the number of chromosomes. So we can simply say is a spontaneous. So we can say is a spontaneous change in the number of chromosomes. Now you still remember from our discussion that in human beings, in the somatic cells, the body cells, we do have what we are calling as being 46 chromosomes. So sometimes a mutation can occur which result in the change in that number, whether that number becomes high or it becomes low. So that is what we are calling as being chromosome mutation. An example of chromosome mutation that you need to remember, an example of chromosome mutation is what we simply call as being Down's syndrome. So Down syndrome is a very good example. But possibly you might wonder, what exactly is Down's syndrome? Well, when we talk about Down syndrome, it is actually a genetic, we can say is a genetic disorder where a person has 47 chromosome instead of 46. So when a person has 47 chromosome instead of 46, that is in human beings, we call that one as being Down syndrome. Now we can talk about maybe briefly signs and symptoms of a person who has Down syndrome. So signs and symptoms of a person that has Down syndrome. One, you are going to find that such a person has got abnormally short limbs. So the limbs are going to be very short. Two, they may have 6 digits in terms of the toes or fingers. So they might actually have an extra toe or finger on the limbs. That's what we mean. So they might have, so you might find the person having slightly more than the normal 5, but they have maybe 6 digit. That may be an indication of that. Then such people experience what we call mental retardation. So mentally they are retarded. So they don't think properly, and they like, because they have got that mental retardation that you may talk about. Then we can talk about they do have maybe a Mongolian face. What do I mean? Well, they have got a round face with maybe you can see them with squinty eyes. So a round face with actually squinty eyes. So those are what we can simply talk about as being some signs and symptoms. Now remember that the chances of having a Down syndrome baby are actually higher in women who have children when they are older, slightly above 35. So that may take place. Mutations are more likely to take place. Thank you so much for watching this video. See you in my next segment as I talk about cell division, such as mitosis and meiosis, and the stages involved. Thank you so much.